Today is our Commitment Sunday, and at the end of the service, you're going to have an opportunity to bring those pledge cards for 2026 forward. But I want you to consider something else for the next many minutes. I want you to think about what this Sunday is in our Christian calendar. Today is the Reign of Christ Sunday, or as it's traditionally known as Christ our King Sunday. I want you to think about why the Christian calendar ends with this particular date, why this particular moment is us declaring together Christ is our King. That you and I make this confession at the very beginning of our faith, that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. And what does that mean for us? Does it have meaning beyond just thoughts in our head about religion? And does it end up being something that we think about our lives in our world? Is Christ our King? Because my guess, if you're anything like me this week, you've lived under other kings and queens this week in your life. You have lived in a different reality, different kingdoms, different stories and narratives that have controlled what you think about life and the world, right? Anyone live in the kingdom of exhaustion this week? Right? Absolutely exhausted, tired, not enough time, right? Not enough of anything, right? How many of you are living in that reality just like myself? And slowly, as I repeat that all of the time, I'm stressed, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I don't have enough time, I slowly begin to convince myself that that is actual reality. That that's the kingdom, and my taskmaster is going to keep putting more and 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 more. Can we say it together? No? On my plate until I collapse. Many of us live in that reality. Some of us are living in a world and reality right now of grief, sorrow, loss. And although it is true, it often becomes the overwhelming, overriding narrative of our lives. It begins to be the king in our lives and does not allow us to get up and take a step forward in our world. Because grief can so encompass us and so immerse us that we can't see anything else. Some of us live in a world where the TV is on 24/7 with political commentary going behind, right? Anyone willing to admit that this morning, that that's your world, right? Hey, we got one, we got two, right? Three, right? And it becomes the overwhelming reality for us, listening to people commentate on a version of reality. And those commentators end up being the ones who interpret our world for us. And my guess is that what comes out of that is mostly fear, anxiety, anger, right? These things that, although have some semblance of reality, should not be the overriding narrative. In the end, we have to realize that we have said that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior, and I live in a different reality, a different kind of kingdom. And that's what's taking place right here in this text in Psalm 46. Now, we have this temptation to come into a text like this and hear these words of comfort and imagine streams of serenity and peace and calm all around us, right? We begin to have these thoughts of like Psalm 23 in our head. Oh God, Lord, Lord is my shepherd. I have want of absolutely nothing, right? I'm sitting beside some streams. It's real nice. But the reality of it is even that particular psalm isn't seated in a place of calm and stillness. It's actually seated in a place of fear, anxiety, crisis, and trouble. Because if you remember later on that psalm, right, there's something about, there's valleys, right? The shadow of death, right? I will fear no evil, for you are with me, right? Psalm 46 is that kind of psalm. When we hear phrases like, be still and know that I am God, it is not shared with those who are already in the stillness. It is shared with people who are in the tumults, that are in the crazy, that are in the chaos, that are in the crisis. In fact, when this psalm was written, there were 185,000 soldiers parked right outside of the gates of Jerusalem. Just like all times in the world, there are empires that rise up. And in particular, here in Psalm 46, there was a new empire on scene, the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians were the biggest, baddest empire that had ever existed in the history of the world up to that point. Okay? I want you to think about that, okay? King Sennacherib was the king of the Assyrians. And what was he good at? Blowing over cities and flattening them. He was really, really good at it. In fact, in this whole history that led up to this, the kingdom of Judah, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, the kingdom of Judah had gone through a period of prosperity. And they had been building up all of these walled and fortified cities in a time period where walled and fortified cities were a new-ish innovation. And they had gotten really, really good at it. And Hezekiah had 14 stronghold cities before you ever reached Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, in that time of prosperity, the people looked around and went, we have a great king and we have all these fortified cities. We are protected. Nothing can touch us. Nothing bad can ever happen because look at all of our prosperity. Does that sound like any other group of people in the world? Imagine, right? Imagine that we as Americans are all the way back in here, right? And we claim all of these things as our stuff. Or let's make it a little closer to home. Let's talk about our church. Justin's a really big fan of talking about all the great things that are happening at church, right? You ever heard that from me? Yeah. Because God does all these incredible things with us, and we do all these walled and fortified cities all over the place, all these incredible ministries. Look at how big this choir is, right? We could do that all day long, friends, right? And all of that is true. And guess what? King Sennacherib brought in 185,000 soldiers and flattened every one of those fortified cities. Every single one of them, all the way up to surrounding Jerusalem itself. And the people are inside of these walls, and they are afraid. And they are terrified because all of their prosperity, all of their success, all the things that they had trusted in, guess what? They didn't stand a chance against the armies of Sennacherib. 185,000 soldiers. Once you imagine what it's like to be inside of those walls in Jerusalem, yes, there's a sense of safety. We're in these walls, but yet you've heard the stories. You may have been even one of those people from one of those other walled cities that have fled now into Jerusalem. It is overcrowded. There are kids everywhere. There is animals everywhere. There is sewage everywhere. And the people are beginning to really freak out. And just beyond those gates, just over those walls, are 185,000 soldiers. And I want you to imagine that scene, because let's be honest, 185,000 people outside your walls is a pretty loud occurrence. And it goes on and on and on for days and weeks and months as Jerusalem is besieged. And you begin to think, this has an inevitable end. This only ends one way: the flattening of Jerusalem and the death of every single one of us inside. How could there be any other reality? And it's into that world that this psalm is sung. Is into that world that God is our refuge and strength. It is into that world where we hear that there is a God who's at work doing miraculous things that none of us could ever imagine. A world where Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. A world where Christ is King. A world where there's a whole different kingdom and reality that is at work. And in that world, there is this phrase, be still and know that I am God. I am exalted among the nations. I am exalted in the earth. That is not a statement that is said because you are sitting beside still waters, friends. That is Jesus Christ on a boat in the middle of the storm saying, peace, be still, and flattening the enemies, flattening the crisis, flattening the chaos. That is God coming in and going, enough with all of this. And I want you to imagine what it means to live in all of these other realities and stories and kingdoms that you and I are living in, that our world and global world is living in. And we begin to think there's an inevitable end to the story. But what if there's something else going on? What if some other reality, God's reality, is at work? In 2 Kings chapter 19, we actually hear the end of this story. The prayers have been prayed. The 185,000 soldiers are outside. In 2 Kings 19:35, it says, that very night the angel of the Lord set out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. When morning dawned, they were all dead bodies. Then King Sennacherib of Assyria left, went home, and lived in Nineveh. No one could ever imagine that that's how that story would end. That not a single person inside of Jerusalem would have to fight, pick up a sword, or do anything. That literally the light dawns from night, and they look out, and the army has been flattened. That the crisis and the chaos that everyone assumed had an inevitable end actually has its entire script flipped. That the entire sense of reality is completely different when we put our strength, our hope, our refuge in God. That you and I can say to ourselves that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. That I can count on God. That in the midst of whatever crisis you and I are facing, whether personal, in our church, in our community right here outside of these walls, in our nation, around the world, that there is a larger story at work. That there is a God that you and I can count on. And when you and I inhabit that narrative, when you and I make that claim and live into it, guess what happens? Not only can we count on God, we begin to become the kind of people that can count on one another. That you and I can say, this is my story. This is the one I'm living in. Will you join me in it? And as we count on God and begin to count on one another, we begin to script out a whole different reality for ourselves. Rather than the story of exhaustion or the story of grief or the story of division or whatever stories you've been living in, you begin to say, no, this is the story of a better world and a better life. A one where I am not always falling behind and not on top of things. A world where I don't have enough, but instead a world of abundance, of eternal, of ever springing forth. What happens when we flip the narrative and realize that God's at work? That means that when I do turn in a pledge card, because, let's be honest, all of you who are members here, you're going to turn in a pledge card. And you look at that card, instead of looking at it like I'm only going to give out of my extra. You're actually going to look at that card as saying, this is part of a narrative for my whole life. My whole of my finances, my whole of my time and schedule, my whole of my energies and talents. I'm looking at the whole thing rather than this little extra over here. I begin to look at it all and go, what can happen in this church and our ministries that we are doing in our world and in our communities here when I look at the card that way? Kate Schwint came up to me before service today with an experience outside of Starbucks, right? So she's going up to Starbucks, and there's a man standing there, a man that is without a house, probably, right? Some sort of homelessness situation taking place in his life. And he has a sign in hand. You know what that sign says? It says, "You are loved." You want to know why that sign says that? Because he has one of our signs. And it says, "You are loved" on it as people are walking into Starbucks. And friends, my hope is that in a world that tells you you're not enough or that you don't have enough, that this homeless man who can stand there and offer every person who walks into Starbucks a different kind of story, a different kind of narrative, will be a shining example to you and I who clearly have homes, who clearly have more than enough, that you indeed are loved because Christ is reigning over all of it.